Hello and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Suz Hinton. Suz is a senior software engineer at Stripe. She's a full-stack engineer that also loves tinkering with hardware, and in addition, she regularly streams live coding sessions on Twitch. She's involved in open source and is a recognized international speaker. Today, she joins me to talk with me about her experience working at Stripe and her prior experience working at Microsoft. So I'm super thrilled. Thank you that you're here today with me.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you recently started working at Stripe. Can you tell me a little bit about your role and what you're currently working on and what are your responsibilities? How does your day-to-day work look like?
I started at Stripe, I think, about 3 months ago, and I'm a developer advocate, I guess, in a way. And so I work with basically a lot of people internally and also with the community and users of Stripe at large. Right now, I'm actually focusing on the terminal product offering that we have. And terminal is an in-person payments product that we have. And so let's say you start out as an online business. A really good example of this is Glossier, who has really awesome cosmetics and personal care items. And let's say you become successful, but you'd then like to go and open a physical retail store. Like we actually have a story there, and we can basically offer you some pre-certified readers. And we have some really nice APIs that are in line with our regular payment APIs in order to get started with that. And so I focus on that particular product. I work directly with the product team. And so right now I'm working with the terminal product team, and I'm trying to reduce the amount of time it takes for you to unbox a reader, to actually get it registered with your Stripe account, and then to start taking a test payment. Right now, I don't think that time is as fast as it could be. And so making a lot of tweaks and changing some of our software and our documentation in order just to get people up and running as fast as possible. So it's a really satisfying project that I'm on right now, just because you can actively feel yourself improving the experience. And then that obviously has a multiplier effect to a lot of software engineers out in the wild who are actually using Stripe Terminal.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And it also sounds like you have to understand the customer. So are you really in contact with the customers?
Yeah, so Stripe does a lot of user research, and I don't necessarily have to always be out there sort of feeling the tough and rough corners of products that we have in order to do that. And so we regularly perform a lot of user research every time we change our APIs, or every time we notice that we have a really interesting new user who has a really interesting case study that we can sort of look at. We tend to reach out to them, and we have a whole team that does that. And we can invite ourselves along to those user research sessions as well for us to learn. We also get a lot of feedback that we solicit via online forums, and also just reaching out to people individually as well. So I think that that's obviously one of the most important parts of my job, is not just to see it from my perspective, but to actually understand how people use this every day, and to kind of challenge a lot of the assumptions that we might make internally about things like API signatures, how you can actually error check and handle errors, but also just, are people understanding how to use our software based on how we're actually presenting the documentation to them as well.
Yeah, I find it really fascinating. So can you tell me a little bit about how you really work with these UX researchers? So you said you can invite yourself to the studies. Then I guess that you also write down their findings in some sort of documents, or how does that really look like? How do you consume those informations?
It's very much like what you said. A lot of the time it can be just a Skype video call, and we talk back and forth and ask them specific questions. Other times we will run a workshop in person, which my team has actually been responsible for running recently, where we will help people onboard to a new Stripe product. Let's say it's billing or terminal, or just payments out of the box as well. And we will observe where they struggled. We actually did this a lot in my previous job as well, which we're going to talk about later. And just feeling that live and having to sort of point out things like, oh, if you click on this link here in the documentation, that will take you through. Or, oh, I've never seen that error before because, I've always taken the happy path when testing out, some of our API signatures and things like that. It can be really illuminating to just watch someone struggle with something that you thought was already a good experience. And so we do like to not just get online form information typed out from people, we do like to kind of have that personal touch where we're actually feeling the emotions and watching the pain that people go through. So we will do in-person and also remote interviews as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good approach to do that. And I've done that several times as well. How do you reach out to those customers? How do you reach out to the people? And how do you get them to agree to spend the time helping you?
I've been surprised at how willing and excited people are to talk to us at Stripe. I think that even though our documentation is known to be very good, I think that everybody always is excited to talk about their business. They're excited to talk to us about how Stripe has really enabled them to take payments so easily and to be able to expand globally. And so I've been surprised and really delighted to find out since I've joined that people are very willing to talk to us. People are very willing to dedicate time to writing up a lot of friction points for them, because they know that this is a company that cares very deeply about the user experience and they feel like the investment's going to be worth it. So a lot of the time, again, we might just spot a lot of activity from a customer as they scale just by looking at our internal metrics, which can cause us to reach out. Or we even might bump into someone at a conference where they might ask us a question that's very interesting to us. And then we will want to follow up with them, via email or via video chat later on. I mean, even this just happened to me this week. I got a question when I was at Chrome Developer Summit, and now I want to actually follow up because it seems like they're having a slight challenge in PCI compliance, retaining that, but also like migrating to, one of our new APIs, which is super interesting. So it tends to come up pretty organically, but I do know that the user research team is actually actively always trying to look at interesting businesses that, are challenging our platform.
Yeah, so I was working with another company right now, and they have some struggles getting their users, to give feedback. And I really think it has all to do with how are you providing value, as you said. I think people recognize that Stripe is providing value to them. And not only that, if they talk to you and tell you the friction points, Stripe will work on those friction points and make the product even better, right? And if you can, bring that message across, I think people are naturally more willing to help, and it's a synergy between the two parties, right? So
absolutely, I totally agree.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So, but how did you apply for this position? How did you decide that you want to work at Stripe, and how did you apply? How did you come across this position?
It's interesting because initially it was Stripe who reached out. However, at the time I was working at Microsoft, I had been there maybe 7 months, which to me doesn't feel like it's quite enough time to sort of evaluate a job and sort of accomplish what you want to accomplish. And so I did actually go into the office. I spoke at length with them. I raised my concerns with leaving a company so early after starting and things like that. So we decided to just table the conversation. And then, pick it up at a later point. And so a little while later, I would say a year and a half later, I'd been at Microsoft for over 2 years at that point. And so I reached out to them again because I felt that it was the right time. I've always really admired Stripe because I used Stripe's APIs when I worked at Kickstarter a while ago, because Kickstarter actually uses Stripe to take pledges from backers for creative projects. And so I was already familiar with how good the documentation was. I was so inspired by that. It made me want to improve my own software and open source documentation. And so it's always been a company I'd admired. It was more just that I didn't think that I was, I guess, like a good enough developer, quote unquote, to apply for a job like that. So when they reached out to me, I just thought it was this amazing privilege. And so I really wanted to eventually come to work for the company, and just had to wait for the time to be right.
So then you reached out, and how did the process go then? What's the application process that you have to go through when you want to work at Stripe?
So I reached out to the original person who I had all of those conversations with all that time ago. They were still at the company. I asked them if they had headcount for the specific role, which was to be in developer relations. And they said yes. So I ended up applying via the official channels, via the website. I submitted my resume, and that process, because they were already interested in potentially hiring me, I did skip the initial phone and technical screening, but then I still had a take-home coding challenge. So the first step was really just doing that coding challenge. after speaking very briefly with a recruiter on the phone so that I knew what the process was. I turned that coding challenge around in basically like the next day just because I wanted to churn through it. And from there, we scheduled an on-site interview. And that's a very similar typical interview as far as, it's a full day, just like other large tech companies. But it was done very empathetically. And so I was sent a giant document basically informing me everything from what to dress, how to dress, which it wasn't telling me exactly what to wear. It was just telling me in a very comforting terms, like what is acceptable and like what people tend to wear to the interview, and to just be myself and like wear something that I'm comfortable in, which was really great. But it also just explained what I can expect to be tested on technically. So what signs are they actually looking for? So instead of walking in and feeling like you have no idea what they're trying to evaluate you on, I walked in feeling like I understood what I was supposed to be showing them, which was really, really great. And every single interview was tailored towards the actual role that I was doing. So I did everything from like a live debugging challenge where I was presented with a repository of code to clone down that when you run the actual main script, it doesn't actually work. It explodes and you have to figure out why. I had to give a spoken presentation for one of the interviews. And that's because in my role, sometimes I'm going to be speaking to customers and users at our user conference, which is called Sessions. And then I spoke with marketing to try and segment different developers based on, different ways to segment. And then also just things like cultural questions and then more technical follow-up as well for me to describe things from a systems point of view, what experience I had writing my own APIs, evaluating my own APIs, and actually like improving the software that I'd written. There was a really, really huge concentration on that as a skill as well. So I really appreciated just feeling like I got an idea of what the job was going to be like based on my interview questions. And they were also super open to me asking all sorts of honest questions too, which I really appreciated. And so that was pretty much the whole process. I came in very briefly to tour the local Seattle office just because that's not where I interviewed. And that's where I would be based and working out of. And after that, the same day, they ended up sending me an offer.
Okay, wow. So actually it went quite quick, the whole interview process, even though it's a very, very thorough process, but the whole experience was quick and positive. That's how you would describe it.
Yeah, they were pretty high touch. Let's say if there were any delays and just, there was a little bit of a delay between my on-site in San Francisco and coming on-site in Seattle just to, speak with the site lead and things like that. There was a little bit of time in between there, but they were very good at being high touch and just keeping me updated. So I thought that was really nice.
Yeah, that sounds good. So a way back, you actually tweeted about leaving Microsoft. And I remember that you expressed that the job that you had to do at Microsoft did not completely fit your personality. Or do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
I can definitely talk about that. I think that everybody's experience at Microsoft is going to differ. So I definitely want people to keep that in mind. There's over 100,000 employees worldwide who work for Microsoft. So this is one tiny little grain of sand experience. And it is very dependent on my personality as well. But I think that my journey at Microsoft was mostly a journey of frustration, but obviously I had a lot of personal growth from it as well. So I don't regret working for the company. But in a nutshell, I feel that the roles that I worked in at Microsoft specifically, the teams were developed to basically run against the grain of a lot of other teams internally. And what I mean by that is, I was hired into a developer evangelism role where I was working with customers and bringing product feedback directly back from the customers to the product teams. And then I actually also worked in a role which was developer advocacy, which was more about trying to do outreach to users, improve our samples, write demos, and go out to customers and actually give best practice talks about how to actually use our stuff. So there were two very different sides to the actual job. And I think that in both cases, we were supposed to be challenging the designs of the Microsoft products we were focusing on. So I was focusing on IoT, for example, and we were supposed to be saying and pushing back and saying, I know that we released this specific feature, but it doesn't fit the customer at all. And we really need to change it. And here are the financial, motivations behind changing this for this customer, and I'm blocking them and things like that. And so you were constantly having to give quite critical feedback. And to teams who traditionally may not have necessarily had a team doing that in the past and having a mandate to actually listen to our feedback. And so when you're really stressed out on a product team and you're trying to ship a lot of features and you're running against these deadlines, and someone is coming and trying to undo that work and telling you you're working on the wrong thing and telling you that this is broken and this could be better, understandably, you're going to get defensive about that if you work on that product team. And understandably, if you're the person giving the feedback, you can get burnt out very easily and you can feel like you're always the bad guy, and you have to have, a certain growth mindset in order for both parties to want to talk and work well together. And that was just incredibly challenging for my personality. Like, I learned how to be less conflict adverse, but at the same time, that was something that was very tough on me. And so that was one aspect of it. The next aspect was just that I learned very quickly, and I was told by a lot of people that, and this again doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, but in my experience, I was told that Microsoft is really just about playing a big game, and that there was a certain hazing ritual you had to go through, and you wouldn't understand how the company works for at least a year of working there. And then things would come into place, and then you would build your network, and then you would understand how to do your job, and then you would start playing this corporate game to get ahead. And I just rejected that from the very first week and got very frustrated at people gatekeeping their networks and expecting me to prove to them why I deserve to have access to their networks internally, and just having to constantly prove myself, even though I wasn't interested in playing that game. And so when I join a company, I just want to do a good job, and I just want to perform at the highest level I possibly can. And I want an environment that supports me to do that. But I'm okay with just, spinning by myself and being super motivated and ambitious and doing that by myself. And I want my work to speak for itself, and I don't want to have to play these really weird social games. And so I just felt like certain things were rewarded that shouldn't have been. And if I did something that I thought was low effort, sometimes people rewarded that in a very exaggerated manner when I just thought I was doing the bare minimum. It was just a very scattered and mixed experience of trying to discover this weird board game that everyone else knew how to play that I didn't know how to play. And that's when I figured out, after 2.5 years of kind of going against the grain, but also just like not wanting to work within that culture, and trying 2 different teams just to see whether I could sort of find a good place. That's when I knew that it was time for me to throw in the towel.
Okay, so you actually worked at different teams during your time at Microsoft?
Yeah, so I started as a technical evangelist, and that's in the sales organization. And that's when I knew that they didn't really screen a lot for technical expertise and things like that. And I felt that I was being held back because when people see that you're in the sales org, they tend to not be as willing to engage with you from a technical point of view. So that's when a new team spun up, which was in the engineering org. So when that started, I waited a few months for the dust to settle and moved over to that team to see if I could get any further in trying to do quality work on the engineering org instead of on the sales org.
Mm-hmm. But your experiences were quite the same between those different orgs?
I would say that they were just different games. And I would say that I was rewarded for doing different things. I think that the second team in engineering was way better set up to succeed. But that didn't necessarily mean that your relations with product teams were any easier to forge, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Everything that you say, I mean, I can totally understand that you wouldn't like to be in that position. I think few people, I mean, some of them might strive in such a setting, but I think few people would really strive in that setting. From my experience working at Microsoft, I see that there is a lot of diversity in teams. Like the culture is very different. I worked with a lot of different product teams always in the engineering org, but even there, I could really see that, for example, the office engineering org is very, very different than, for example, Windows or, Visual Studio, things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's really interesting to hear your experience there. So looking back at the things, can you say that you learned something that you would do different? And when you now decide to join a company, even, when you decided to join Stripe, which signs and signals did you look for that you think, well, these signals somehow, if you will fit there and if you will be happy and if you can strive there?
For sure. I think the first thing that I learned was to ask really tough questions in an interview. I think that because the Microsoft door opening for me came so sporadically and out of the blue, I was sort of just like really swept up in the excitement of the fact that Microsoft, actively reached out to me and that they were excited about hiring me. And I spoke to a few people on the team who had only actually been there for about 3 months. So they were still obviously really excited to be there. And I think that I just didn't do my due diligence because I got too excited. And I always feel like I don't have the power in that dynamic. And so I should have realized that if Microsoft's reaching out to me, that maybe I have safety in asking some of the tougher questions in the interview and not being afraid of asking them. And just trying to find people within the company that are of a similar personality to me that I can talk to. And I've definitely done that since. I asked much more tough questions at Stripe. I also interviewed at Google and Amazon as well at the same time. And I asked very, very, very specific questions and actually asked to speak to more people even after my interviews. So, I wanted to follow up with someone who, let's say, works on open source at Google in their spare time and what are the challenges behind IP ownership and things like that. And so I tried to be a lot better this time around in doing that. Given that I was in obviously a very privileged position, I was interviewing for, several large tech companies. I sort of sized up whether or not, I was in a position where I had the safety to do that. And I did this time. So that was really good. I think also just the signal to look for once you join a company is, are people giving you weird advice like they're trying to teach you how to play a specific game? I think that's something that I was very frustrated upon running into at Microsoft early on. But I definitely feel that maybe I stuck it out a little too long and didn't trust my gut. I think it's important to mention that changing jobs for me is not just sneaking out, doing an interview and signing on the dotted line and giving my 2 weeks notice. I'm actually not an American citizen or an American permanent resident, but I do work in the United States. And so I require visa sponsorship, which is a multi-month, very stressful, very bureaucratic process every time I want to change jobs. And so I do tend to dig in a little longer. Just because psychologically and mentally it takes a huge toll, and financially too, takes a massive toll on me to change jobs. But I think that that's just put more importance on me asking the right questions before I join a company. And I think that that's actually been a really positive outcome that's come from that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I was also US visa sponsored, and I was always super frightened that one day I would get fired and I don't know what to do.
Yes, I absolutely relate to that.
I don't know, it wasn't very realistical event or something, but if there were layoffs, I was like completely shut down. I was like, oh my God, the company is laying off people. And what happens, if they would decide to lay me off?
Yes,
because
I was terrified.
It's really tricky, right? Yeah, it's tricky. It's not that easy if you cannot just stay. I don't know if I recall correctly, but I had in mind that within 2 weeks, I actually have to find a new job that would fit to the visa that I had and things like that. So
it's so scary.
It is, right? Yeah, it is. It is. That's really true. So, well, can we talk a little bit about the software engineering process at Stripe? Because I'm super interested in how, different companies and different people, different teams develop software. And one of my favorite topics is code reviews. So I would love to talk about code reviews with you. What code review practices have you experienced during your career at the different companies, and what stands out for you where you think, well, that makes a good code review practice?
Most of the code review practices I've been through at companies have been pretty similar to each other. I think that the first job I worked in where there was actually code review, because that wasn't always a thing in my career, somebody would write an entire feature. They would take maybe 3 months to write this too. And sometimes in isolation, because if you're working for a startup, sometimes you're just owning the entire product. And before bundling up to deploy, basically like the highest ranking person in engineering would then sit down with that person and just go through it together, which to me is like incredibly laborious and isn't necessarily productive to catching easy things that could have been caught early on. And so I saw like a lot of major refactors being needed at that time. And so as I've sort of worked at a variety of places, the most common approach to this, which is very different to that, is to look into continuous deployment, which means that you're actually just bundling up a couple of different commits, whether that's in Git or another source control method. Usually you just bundle up something small, something that's sort of self-encapsulated, and then you ask for at least one person to review it. So Stripe is no different from that. Stripe deploys lots and lots of times a day, and they have a lot of different engineers actually working on the same service/services. And so it's the same kind of mentality. So you work on something, it doesn't necessarily have to be the full feature complete. You open a pull request and you assign a specific person, and then we have a bunch of gates in the way, such as automated testing and also human reviewers, in order for that to then become mergeable and then deployable out to production.
Mm-hmm. And does Stripe have any guidelines or real policies around at least one person of, that team or with that, expertise has to look through? Or is that your diligence to, select the right reviewer for your code piece?
So we are pretty strict about requiring at least one person to look at it. Part of that is just the nature of the payments industry. When you're handling people's money and when you're writing software, in order to do that, there are certain requirements and compliance requirements that we need to actually satisfy in order to keep our code secure, in order to keep people's information secure. And so just as a general rule, we always have at least one person looking at the code that someone else wrote, just to remain compliant with those requirements. Beyond that, though, you are allowed to choose who you think is the best person to look at something. It doesn't necessarily fall down to this mandatory hierarchy, and you are trusted to choose the correct person, with the right knowledge, but also with the right amount of fresh eyes to look at something that you've written, in order to gauge whether or not, everything seems to check out okay. So I really like that. I think that's very empowering. And also, it's a really nice opportunity to pair with people and learn from other people, given that, we always require that out of the gate.
Yeah. So one of the topics that I wanted to talk with you about is mentoring junior developers. And I know that you do that. Can you tell me a little bit about how you do that and what you focus on when mentoring junior developers?
So I definitely got into mentoring accidentally, and I still feel that I still do that. What I've found is that, I've been a senior engineer for a number of years now. This is my 15th year in the field, and that industry that we're in has just changed so quickly in that amount of time. And I think now that juniors who are entering the field have to know a lot more than I did when I first got started. I think that back in the early 2000s, it was a lot more scrappy. There was no concept of cloud computing. There was no real JavaScript on the front end because it wasn't performant, and things like that. There were just so many, I guess, like extra things that I just didn't have to learn that people have to learn these days. So I have a lot of empathy for juniors entering the field. I would say that they're at least 2 to 3 times more qualified to not qualified, because that's kind of like a judgy thing, but just they're 2 or 3 times more knowledgeable entering the field compared to when I entered, right? And so I think that that's something to be respected. And also they're probably feeling very overwhelmed because they also, even though they know a lot more, they also know how much more they need to know. So a lot of the time, I would see juniors get hired into companies that I worked at, and then I would come in on their first day, and I'd be like, oh, cool. So where are they going to sit? And then I would find out nobody had assigned a seat to them. And then I would say, oh, okay, so like who is their buddy? And they'd be like, oh, it's Stephen over there, but Stephen's actually in meetings all day. And then I would just start tearing my hair out because I thought, oh, if that was me starting, I would just feel so unwelcome and so just like left in the deep end, and I would feel a lot of imposter syndrome and things like that. So it came out of just like heartache and a bleeding heart to just help smooth over that experience. But I found that a lot of other senior engineers who I worked with were not actually super stoked or, to mentor, or if they did put their hand up, they didn't really understand what the commitment was. So it came out of an arrogance on my part of, I can do better than this, and I really, really want to make their experience a lot better than it is. And so usually I would voluntarily reach out to someone and say, hey, I know that you've got X person that you're studying with, or I know that this person onboarded you and that onboarding is now complete, but would you like to have someone going forward who you can pair with, maybe at a minimum of 2 hours a week, but if you wanted to bug me for questions, you can also do that. And my prerogative was to mentor them technically, which then kind of bleeds into helping them level up their career and learn how to work with teams and things like that. I think if you start with the technical, it sort of fans out to them also asking other questions about how their career relates to the technical side of what they're learning as well. And so it just came out of a want to make other people stronger in order to make my own engineering team stronger. And also, I have a teaching background, so I do miss teaching a little bit. And so it kind of helps me express that as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you explain that like that, I feel like, oh, I want to be your mentee. It sounds really cozy. And, I would have loved if somebody reaches out and offers, to, answer some questions. I actually didn't experience that in my career. That I really felt like, oh, I can go there and it would have helped so much and still would, right? I mean,
yes.
Right now, actually, I'm seeking out mentors a lot more proactively. But I've never had a person come up to me and say, oh, do you need some help?
Yeah.
So right now I'm really seeking out mentors and, proactively approach people and ask questions.
Yeah.
I don't think that they think they are my mentors. I feel they are my mentors. But yeah, I totally see the value in that. And I think it's so wonderful that you do that. And so you also said that you're starting with the technical side, which I like a lot because that's concrete, right? That's, you're sitting down, you're looking at a piece of code. They have questions, about how to do something. And yeah, it's very concrete and it's very clear. And then it evolves into something more. So you also said that you're helping them advancing their career. So how do you do that for yourself? How do you develop your soft skills, communication, conflict management, empathy, and also, fitting into a team and things like that?
I actually find this side of engineering really, really challenging. And so you discussed before how you didn't really have any mentors in your career so far, and you've only just started doing that. I didn't have a single mentor until I actually started at Microsoft. And the person they paired me with was just like so incredibly the same as me, which was very helpful. And so I would say that developing those skills for myself was a lot harder and came a lot later in my career. And so that mentor, because I knew that they were a very similar personality to me, but they'd been at the company a year and a half and had enjoyed quite a lot of success, I knew that if it was possible for them to achieve success, even though there were different things at play, for example, this mentor was a man, I'm a woman, and so obviously we have different sort of cultural things that we can, different cultural challenges we can run into. I figured that if they were able to be successful with their mindset and their approach to things, then maybe I could be successful too. So I just tended to ask them a lot of questions. I tended to interrupt them a lot and say, hi, I've run into this challenge where I want to work with X person, but it seems like they're not super willing to work with me. Have you bumped into that before, and how did you solve it? And so it was a very slow process of me just saying, do you ever feel like this? And they'd be like, mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, how did you solve that? Mostly because I think that I've gone through like a huge chunk of my career being the only developer or the only front-end developer or the only technical person in a company. That was my first 7 or 8 years of my career. And so landing on a team when you're that many years into your career is incredibly challenging. And I really just had to bunker down, observe people, try and mirror their behaviors until I figured out enough to be competent. And then from there, I could sort of ask some of the harder questions. And so definitely just, if you don't have a mentor, trying to kind of model yourself after others you admire can be a very effective way of sort of upgrading your skills, so to speak.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. A lot. and so and so have you ever thought about, becoming a leader, manager, something like that, or do you want to stay in the individual contributor role?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge in my career. I think just given that there aren't actually that many women who I encounter very often now who have been in the industry as long as I have. And there are like quite a few, don't get me wrong, but you just don't encounter them very often. So sometimes I feel alone in this, but I've been a tech lead twice. That's the closest I've gotten to management. And I've had people unofficially reporting to me before, but it's been more of a mentoring role, and it's not like a pay grade or an official title. It's more just that, hey, this person really likes learning from you, so can you just check in with them and do one-on-ones every week? But I'm not actually doing their expenses. I think that's the closest I've ever gotten. It's not something that I'm interested in the slightest. I love sitting down and just coding every day. I mean, in developer relations, you don't get to code for the entire 8 hours, but I still get to ship stuff. I still get to focus on APIs, and I still get to sit around and mess around in Docker, seeing if I can, make an experience better. And I still get to actually open PRs and look at other people's code and talk to people and have those technical conversations. Some managers are able to juggle a little bit of both. But I just don't think that I'm the right person for that. I think that I still would need to work on my conflict resolution skills and things like that. I just don't know that I have the right stuff, but I'm also not super interested in becoming so good at this stuff that being a manager would be easy. I would rather just be really good at working with other engineers, really good at talking to the business, and really good at coding. If I could just have that lovely trifecta and stay an individual contributor and keep shipping things, that would be my perfect balance. And so I've definitely turned down almost every management role or anything that looks like management these days. I tend to run away from, just because my tech lead experiences weren't particularly fulfilling either.
And do you have the feeling that at Stripe you can stay and progress as an individual contributor? I know that at Microsoft, this individual contributor path can really, you can advance your career and really become a thought leader in the company, right? So is something similar happening at Stripe? Do you see that?
I've looked at the engineering ladders. There's a slightly different engineering ladder for developer relations, just because we're not just sitting around shipping stuff all day, right? So you have to show leadership and not just writing good code. And obviously engineers have to also show good teamwork skills and technical leadership skills too. I'm not discounting that. But yeah, we do actually have different career ladders, even just within engineering, for different roles, which I really like, because that's tailored towards making it clear what's required and making it clear what your opportunities are. So in a lot of the engineering ladders that I've read internally at Stripe, there are actually forks in the road where you can go towards the manager track or you can fork off the other way. And the manager track is kind of seen as is more treated as a career change as well, which I really like, just from a cultural perspective. And so I think that that's been a really good thing to give me the confidence that I'm going to have long-term success here, because I can already see examples as well on different product teams and engineering teams of people who have succeeded at that, and people who I can talk to in order to find out, what was successful for them to reach that level.
Yeah, I really like those career change mentality, that you think management is a career change and isn't a progression, right? And if you're not becoming a manager, it means that you're somehow stuck, which is somehow implied at some companies. But I see more and more companies that really have, as you said, this career change mentality, where you just, can go on with what you're really passionate about. And when that's technology, right? And tinkering with your code and things like that. And that's what you become an expert on, right?
There's also another distinction within the, I guess, like the individual contributor track, which is there are certain career levels where you can communicate that you don't want to proceed to the next level. Does that make sense? And so for a lot of people, that sounds counterintuitive and it sounds really unambitious, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. And so you can reach a certain level where you can just say, I would like to stay on this level now for X amount of years, or I would like to stay here forever, or I would like to stay here until I change my mind. And what that means is when people have different abilities, different capabilities, different thresholds for things, they might just really, 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 really love the work that they are expected to do on a certain level, and they don't want to give that up. And they don't want to feel pressured to move to the next level of taking on things that aren't necessarily something that they would really want to get up out of bed in the morning to do. I think that's an enormous privilege to have in a company where where a lot of the time the mentality is you always need to be like being the absolute best, but that's a really subjective term because moving up levels doesn't necessarily mean you actually improve at what you do. It just means that you satisfied certain requirements or you got really lucky and got a really large responsibility project and, the CEO noticed it and, thought that should be recognized. I think it's really wonderful to just say, no, actually, I think I'm actually really good here right now. And that can be really supportive as well for people who may not be in a certain situation in their life where they can take on that extra challenge either. And that was something that really stood out to me when I started at Stripe, where you can actually opt to stay at a certain level once you've gotten to a certain competency within the company.
Yeah, I love that. I really love that because I think it's a comic or something where you see that people, they always progress to the next level until they are completely out of their competence, right? So they're incompetent in what they do. And yeah, you're totally right. If you are good at what you do, right, and you love what you do, have a passion for it, why change? Maybe sometimes, and maybe it's for several years, maybe it's for half a year, whatever, right? It's just right to be where you are. And I think it's really about seizing the moment, and it doesn't have to always be the change that you are striving for. I really like if you can have both, right? So I know that there are some companies that when you're hired into a position, it's expected that you always stay in that. I don't think that's really a good thing, but I love that if you can choose, right? Now I'm feeling that I can do something else. I can take on a new challenge, or as you said, I'm staying where I am because I'm actually doing really good work right now and I like it.
Yeah. I think it gives people space to do their best work. And sometimes their best work is not necessarily going and learning something new. Sometimes it's just that they're just going to be so ultra valuable on something and it aligns so well with the team and them as well. And I think that's a wonderful thing to celebrate and something that tends to be judged as being unambitious. And I think that that's the wrong way to think about it.
Yeah, I agree. So one of the things that I want to talk with you about is the regular live coding events that you have on Twitch. So first of all, can you tell me a little bit more about live coding and also to the listeners, what is live coding? Why do you do it? How did you start? Everything. We want to know everything.
So live coding tends to fall into two different tracks. I'm on one of them. There's the track that you actually perform at a show like a DJ and you live code visuals and things like that. So sometimes that can get people can get confused about the two definitions. So that's one definition. I have friends that do that. The other definition, which is probably like a more recent one, is the phenomenon of coding, but then sharing yourself coding live via the internet. So that's usually sharing your screen. Sometimes it's sharing your webcam as well and your voice. And then people can just watch and listen to your process and actually see that live via a video stream, essentially. And so that's what I do every Sunday. I've been doing it for around 3 years. I take breaks if I need to travel or whatever, but it's usually almost every single Sunday. And we just sit down for 2 hours and I explain some pull requests that I'm looking at to potentially merge, or I'm preparing a demo for a talk that I'm giving that's coming up, or just really anything that I need to get done on that Sunday that I'm going to enjoy working on. I like to kind of show that. And I think it's fun for people to learn from, but it's also fun for me because I learn from other people as well. And it just provides me with a little company while I'm working on something.
I imagine it's super stressful, to be honest. I mean, I'm very afraid of interviews, for example. And it also, if somebody looks over my shoulder that I'm not very familiar with, I mean, if it's a colleague that I trust, that's okay. But a stranger, for example, looking over my shoulder, I sometimes forget where the keys are on my keyboard. Like suddenly I can't type anymore. So how do you deal with that? Do you enjoy it? Did you enjoy it from the beginning on, that people actually see what you do? Do you get nervous? And if I would like to do that, what would you advise me? How can I get over my fear of being observed and judged and things like that?
I think this is a very valid concern. And just for the record, I still perform super badly in interviews, especially whiteboarding interviews and things like that. Like if you asked me the question casually when I was in my house, I would be able to immediately solve it. But if you put me on the spot in a power dynamic where someone is literally judging me on my abilities and has something that I want, such as I would really like this job, and impressing this person relies on that, then I completely fall apart. I forget basic programming, concepts. I just don't know what it is, and I've tried to overcome that for years. With live coding, it felt very similar at first, so you're not actually wrong likening that. And I used to rehearse what I was going to do the night before, which meant essentially I was doing double the work, because I would basically type it out, see where I was going to get stuck, and then the next day I would do exactly the same thing. Which is very counterintuitive, and you could tell at first I was trying to impress, but I was also trying to provide a really good experience for other people. It was more about them than it was about me, even though it was also about me trying not to look like I had, trying not to look like I'd forgotten how to program. But I eventually became comfortable, just because you start out with a really small audience when you live code, because not a lot of people know what you're doing. You don't even have to tell anyone what you're doing, and you can just sort of like very slowly ease into it and get used to it. That's the technique that I used. For the first month, I rehearsed every single project I was going to work on, and also just didn't really tell anyone about it. Then I started watching my videos back, looking at what issues I was running into and things like that, gaining the confidence, looking at what I actually liked that I did good, and gaining confidence through that. And then I just slowly kind of stopped caring about it. And I actually can live code on stage much easier now too, if I'm doing a demo or something. I think for me, it's when people are looking at my fingers, I forget how to type. I'm exactly the same as you. But on the stream, they can't actually see your fingers. Okay. They can see how slow you're typing, but they can't necessarily see your fingers. The one thing that I will say, though, is when you're coding by yourself and you're listening to the perfect music, or you're listening to silence or whatever, you're always going to be very productive compared to when you're on the stream. I'm looking at the chat. I'm trying to talk aloud while I'm programming. I'm running into bugs. And again, I'm feeling those judging eyes on me when I run into bugs. And I do the exact same thing in interviews where my mind goes blank. So it's going to happen. And you have to be comfortable with the fact that some people are going to think that that's literally your coding ability, and you can't do anything about that. But I tend to try these days to communicate and defend that live coding is much harder than it looks, and you will never, ever be as smart and fast and productive as you are when you're alone.
Yeah, I mean, I have 2 kids, and if they make a scene out in the wild, and then all the other parents look at me and I feel super judged. Like, somehow this reminds me on that. It's like, oh my God, I'm not that bad parent, It's like, it's just, it looks like.
Exactly. Yeah. I actually spoke to a young parent who she said the same thing to me this week, and she's a programmer as well. And it was funny that we were comparing that.
So why do you use Twitch and not YouTube? Is there something like a streaming community on YouTube as well? Or is Twitch the platform if you want to do that?
There is. It's kind of odd, because I think that conceptually YouTube makes more sense, because YouTube is a variety platform, whereas Twitch is more geared towards gamers. I think the difference is that Twitch started out as a streaming platform, like live streaming, and YouTube has more sort of expanded into that offering. So I think that Twitch has a better foothold and a better and deeper story about the nuances of how different live streaming is to pre-recorded videos. I think that YouTube is catching up, but I find that the discoverability of live streams on Twitch based on categorizations and things like that, and then also just the different and very nuanced moderation tools on Twitch are also just better in general, even though it's designed for gaming platforms. And it can be a very strange phenomenon of weird cultures of emotes and, different ways of getting streamers' attention and things like that. I think that it's just a more mature platform as to knowing what streamers need and the tools that they need in order to get the job done.
So I watched some of your past streams because they are actually on Twitch as well, and you can go there and you can just replay one of those. And I saw that, well, there's a lot of chat going on, and I've wondered, how can you even, how can you not only chat? I mean, there are several people, 100 people writing to you, and you're one person that has to respond or read every comment. And then you have to do the other task as well. So do you do that on your own, or do you have another person that actually looks at? Because I know, for example, for webinars, you sometimes have a team. Then you're giving the talk, and if I, for example, have a webinar and I teach something, then I have a team maybe that's handling the questions with the audience. But for that, it looks like you do everything yourself.
It's so hard. It is really hard. And this is where I come back to, you just become the worst programmer in the world because you're basically, it's like people dancing in front of you and asking you questions about every character you're typing. Essentially, imagine trying to get work done in an office that was like that, where everyone's like yelling at you all at once while you're trying to type something. Yeah, so you are correct. And I have between 250 and 300 people every stream that watch me. And on average, I have around 100 people in the chat. So you are correct there. It is really hard. I try to just sort of subconsciously have like a time box where I'll code and talk for a bit, then I'll look at the chat. Maybe I'll have to scroll up a little bit because there was too much activity, and then come back, sort of answer the questions, come back, and then keep coding. You'll notice, and when I watch my own streams back just for analysis, you'll see that there are some questions where I'm like, oh, I missed that question, or she ignored that person. So, there's no way to do it perfectly. But I found that after I've made some of my regular viewers who are really, really good community members, I've made them moderators. A lot of the time they will answer questions that are very common that come up, such as what font is that in your terminal, or are you using Vim, or what project are you working on right now? So we have chatbot shortcuts that can help answer some of those common questions, which leaves me more time to kind of look at some of the more meaty questions. But I don't have a perfect answer for this because it is actually really hard. I just train myself to, after a certain amount of time, just, feel like, okay, I should look over and have a look at it. But yeah, it does feel like a one-man band a lot of the time, even though I do have moderators that help me out with some of the more simple stuff.
And so why do you do that? Why do you do live coding? What do you get out of it? Yeah. What motivates you to do that?
I think initially I was feeling frustrations with a few things, which was why I started. The first thing was like when I mentored people one-on-one, that didn't scale very quickly. And I felt that people kept, I guess, putting me on a pedestal because of the open source work I did, because it's like hardware and IoT related, but they didn't understand, no matter how many times I tried to communicate it, that, well, if you wanted to contribute to this project, you don't necessarily have to have any electronic knowledge, because I am still coding it all in JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript, then there is still, a lot of areas of my software where you could improve certain patterns, or you could help me update dependencies, or you could fix documentation, or you could just, refactor small parts to a more modern version of, the JavaScript language, because I have a lot of stuff that I wrote in the ES5 because that's all we had back then, and so I tried to convince people of that, and they just sort of smiled and nodded. And so I sort of thought, well, I'm just going to show people. And I'm also going to show people that I'm not some hardware wizard that gets everything perfect every time. I do make mistakes. And, I want people to see why I enjoy working on open source in my spare time as well. And maybe people will be less afraid of contributing, and maybe I'll be able to make some more friends via open source, that way.
And do you feel that you made some friends in that community now on Twitch?
Definitely. In fact, in, I think, just over a week's time, I'm going to meet two of them in Europe, which I'm really excited about. there are two people who have been contributing to one of my projects for almost, I think, a year and a half now. And they're just the most wholesome, wonderful people who turn up in my stream a lot. They're both moderators as well. They help me, moderate any bad behavior I have. And honestly, the project is so much better as a result of contributions from not just those two people, but a lot of other people. And so it kind of is this reminder every Sunday that there are nice people on the internet. And I think that in enough is a reward to me, knowing that there's people out there who understand why I'm doing this, who understand that I'm trying to create nicer communities and are willing to be part of that and help me defend that community.
Okay, that sounds really nice. So Twitch is really a cornerstone for you to build your community, to make open source more welcoming, showing you to the people, communicating on again. I think it comes maybe back to how you mentor, right? You said you start with code. You actually start with the problem, with the hard facts, right? And if you are using Twitch and you're showing how you code, how you approach problems, you're again back at the very basic of what programming is about, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, even though you said you started 3 years ago, I think it's a very new phenomenon, and it's just starting to get traction all over the place. What do you think? What's the future of live coding?
Yeah, I mean, there were people before me too, such as Handmade Hero and Vlambeer Game Studio, but I think that now people are starting to actually understand why it's beneficial. And I think that a younger generation who loves to learn from videos is definitely, rising up into our field. And so it's gaining a lot of relevancy from there too. So yeah, I think this was an insightful chat about it.
Well, thank you so much, Suz, for joining my show today. I think we talked a lot about very different topics and areas. So if we want to reach you, we can go on Twitch. How do I find you there?
Yeah, so on most social media, my username or handle is Noopcat or Noopcat. You can pronounce it any way you like, and that's NOOPKAT. And so I am twitch.tv/Noopcat, and on Twitter, I am twitter.com/Noopcat as well.
Yeah, I will link everything in the show notes so that people can find you. Thank you so much for showing me, your work, and also getting me some insights into live streaming. So thank you, Suz, for joining my show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Bye.